Hello and welcome once more to Conscious TV. I'm Iain McNay and my guest today is Ravi Ravindra. Hi Ravi.
Nice to see you.
And Ravi has written lots and lots of books, and I must confess I've only actually got 3 of them here, but these 3 are very interesting in their own right and all very different. There's one, Krishnamurti, Two Birds on One Tree, small book, but interesting book about his time with J. Krishnamurti. Heart Without Measure, Gurdjieff work with Madam de Salzmann, which from the title tells you it's about his work with the Gurdjieff work with Madam de Salzmann, who took over the lineage, if you like, of the Gurdjieff work and held it for many, many years. And one that came out relatively recently, I think, Science and the Sacred. And you have another book that came out called The Pilgrim's Soul.
Yes.
Quite recently, which I haven't got. And you have a new one coming out as well, don't you?
Well, the new one is in press now. It's called Listening to Krishna.
Okay.
Really a new translation of the Bhagavad Gita with my commentary on it. Because the Bhagavad Gita is perhaps the single most important book to emerge from India, and therefore naturally not easy to comprehend. So
yeah.
I have wrestled with it for many years.
Okay. So you had an interesting childhood. I know your mother was actually illiterate.
Completely illiterate.
Your father was very educated.
Yes.
You were 6 out of 7 children. And it was an arranged marriage, but a very happy marriage apparently.
Yes, generally quite happy, but like in all marriages, there are, I'm sure, difficulties and this and that. But I mean, as kids, we were not aware of any particular difficulties in the marriage.
Yes.
No, but particularly at that time, my father was born in 1904, and I'm sure he got married before about the age of 20 years old or something like this. It would most marriages in India would have been arranged marriages. But people often don't realize, after all, royal family marriages are always arranged marriages. Because the arrangement there requires the whole family agreeing, the astrological charts agreeing, and many things have to agree. And so his arrangement. And I think we sometimes place too much importance on literacy. One can be very highly thoughtful without necessarily reading this or that.
Mm. But you read something when you were a teenager that was quite, it made an impact on you. The words, "I am a voice without a form."
This is actually a remark of Swami Vivekananda. Yes, I think almost everything I have read by him made a great impact on me. Part of the background there, just quickly, just as people here in the Western world, they are naturally become aware of what goes on in the name of Christianity, how many priests or ministers are behaving in a very unholy manner, etc. Similarly, of course, in India. This is not a peculiar problem of Christianity. This is a problem everywhere. So I, as a young boy, was quite convinced that these priests or the Hindu priests, etc., are not really behaving in any right manner from whatever I could see. But then coming across Vivekananda, reading something by him, it's not that it changed my mind about the priests, but it completely changed, it had a different resonance in my heart. For example, his remark that religion is not for the weak, but for the strong. Now, earlier I would have thought just the other way around. So, this remark of his, I am a voice without a form, as if all forms are needed, but they also confine something. Religious forms are a very good example of this. various religious forms are needed, the churches are needed, the temples are needed, but they invariably also exclude something. So to some extent, of course, he is using a language. This itself creates a certain kind of restriction. But his very strong feeling, which comes across actually in all of his other writings as well, that he does not wish to be pinned down by this form or that expression of religion. So to come to something really free. So I was very struck.
And that obviously attracted you and helped you to
Very
find
much.
a
Very
path in life, because it was quite a difficult time, wasn't it, in your teenage years, because there was a lot of violence.
Well, it was soon after India became independent, but it also was the time when India was divided into Pakistan and India. There was a lot of violence, mostly in the name of religion, and some of which I saw actually from the balcony. I was relatively young, 9 years old, but watching great mayhem taking place outside. That was another reason I was, as it were, against religion. In fact, my older brother later on joked with me. He said, since he knew my attitude towards religion, he said, it serves you right that you should retire as a professor of religion, which is what I did. So that was, but you see what goes on in the name of religion these days, you can see. So it's enough to put any reasonable person off. But I was a young boy, and seeing all this was emotionally it violated something inside.
Yes, and there was also something else calling you, I think, wasn't there, in terms of wanting to find the truth?
Well, my feeling is, one cannot be sure of these things, but my impression is that absolutely every human being has a little spark of that somewhere deep down in us. Now, I could put this in a more traditional terms, but that is only a later expression. Certainly in the Indian tradition, very strong idea, in fact in all spiritual tradition, that we have a particle of divinity in us, and its whole meaning is that it is searching for truth. We could call it God, sometimes one has other words for it, Allah or Brahma or Holy Spirit, many other words. But that there is something so deep-seated in every human being. But of course, very simple illustration of this, every magnetic needle one characteristic is to point to the magnetic north. But if there are other big magnets around, it cannot point to the magnetic north. So most of us, even though we may have this little magnetic needle in us, which wishes to find the truth or point towards truth or God, but it cannot do so because we have many other distracting magnets, such as all kinds of ambition to get ahead in the world. All our education system is oriented to this, and it really begins even with the parents. Parents, in a way, quite rightly, they wish their children to prosper, to do well. But what does it mean to do well? So only a few students would get scholarship, so you should be among those few. Only a few would, after they graduate, will go to do a master's or a PhD. So you should be among those. You see what I'm saying? So the parents actually, in a way, almost wish to create that. Understandably, that's how our society runs. All of it is based on reward and punishment. Wish for approval or a fear of disapproval. And it begins very early. Every baby wants approval from his parents.
Well, absolutely, the conditioning is so strong in so many levels.
But
yeah.
so my impression is, it's not that I alone had that wish for truth. I think everybody has it. But then do the surrounding circumstances or education or even the people they meet, for example, in my own case, as I said, coming across the writings of Vivekananda, kind of it lights that flame. but something clearly existed in a dormant fashion, and my impression is it exists in everybody.
Yes.
It's not this kind of thing you can prove or disprove, because if you do a sociological survey of this, how many people are interested in something like this?
Yeah. To move on, you met somebody when you were around 30 called Louise Welch, who became your teacher and was very influential for many years.
Yes, I would even say she was really like my spiritual mother.
Okay.
And yes, she's of course passed away now. She was a teacher, a senior person in the Gurdjieff teaching in New York. Also her husband, Dr. and Mrs. Welch, is really there. Dr. Welch was, actually he was president of the New York Cardiological Association, etc. He was a medical doctor, and I think she was very influential in my life for varieties of reasons. Apart from her general guidance, she was also, I did not know that initially when I met her, she was very interested in the Indian tradition, especially the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, the reason why I have written this book now recently, which is not yet published, is actually dedicated to her. She was the one who asked me to give a talk about the Bhagavad Gita. And my attitude earlier growing up in India was, oh well, it's a document of social engineering, just trying to keep the caste system going and put people in their place, etc. So I was not particularly interested in it. But she was the one who suggested to me that I should read this and think about it and to give a talk about it. And then she asked me to speak about it on several occasions, and that was very important in my life, actually, that whole turning. No, she was, as I said, she was really my spiritual mother.
But you spent time with J. Krishnamurti before you really got deeply engrossed in the Gurdjieff work, is that correct?
I don't know whether I would say that I spent time with him. I certainly had met him.
But you told quite a few stories about him in this,
Yes.
in this little book here.
But some of those meetings are actually, as I say, I first met him in 1965, and my last meeting with him was in 1985, about 10 months before he passed away. So some of those stories are really over that period of 20 years. But I met him in...
I'm going to interrupt you because the first time you met him, just tell briefly the first time you met him, because that's a great little story.
Well, actually, first time when I, as it were, saw him, I did not know that this was J. Krishnamurti. My wife, who, before she was my wife, she was a Canadian young lady at the age of, I think at the age of 21, she went to India as a volunteer. This was actually an organization later on called CUSO, Canadian University Service Overseas, which was actually taken as the model by the Peace Corps later on. And she had never heard of Krishnamurti, but she was placed in a Krishnamurti school to teach English and physical education, which was her field. In any case, after we got married, this was 4 years later, in 1965, we went to India, and she wanted me to deliver something to one of the ladies where she was actually from Vienna, married to an Indian gentleman, where Krishnamurti used to stay when he came to Delhi. But I had no idea of this. So I just went to deliver this, and I see this man sitting there on the sort of the porch outside the big door to the house. It was a big house. And I just assumed it was somebody who's, you know, in India, rich people would have people attending to the house, etc. And so I asked him if the lady of the house was inside, and he said, I'm not sure. So he went inside to check and comes back and tells me that she's not here. In fact, wish I could wait for a few minutes. I guess just coming from Canada, one is always in a hurry. Not in India, it's a slightly different attitude. So I just basically left that whatever present I had to deliver. But I kept looking at this man. He had an absolutely extraordinary presence. But I had no idea who he was. So I'm going back on my bicycle, but I'm looking back so much so that I run into a bunch of sheep or a bunch of goats actually coming on the on the street, and I fell down. A few weeks later, we had gone to Varanasi. Krishnamurti had a school there at Rajghat, just outside what used to be called Banaras earlier. Actual Indian name is Varanasi. And there a meeting was organized by the people there for me to meet Krishnamurti. And I was absolutely amazed to see this is the man I had seen. And he looked much taller at that time to me, which
But
itself
when you first saw him, you felt he had a special quality without knowing what it was.
a very
what
different kind of
Yes.
presence, really.
Yes.
Unusual. And
Yeah.
even almost as if a different physical size. He was even shorter than I am
Yeah.
in actual size.
Yeah. And so when you started to, were you ever his student as such, or were you more? How would you describe your relationship with him?
Well, in a way, I think Krishnamurti would be unhappy to have anybody call himself or herself as his disciple or something like this. No, I was very drawn to him, really, in a way, partly from whatever I had heard about him, especially from my wife, actually, who had gone walking with him, etc., earlier. This is before we had even met, my wife and I. And my own impression was, well, really what I said to Krishnamurti, as a matter of fact, in my very first meeting. I had just hardly a few months earlier finished a PhD in physics, and people imagine that you are an educated man. And my feeling very strongly was that I did not really know anything what I would regard truly worth knowing. Now, it's always a very tricky question, what is really truly worth knowing? For me, part of that always has to do with somewhere deep down to know what am I, why am I here on this planet? And any PhD in physics, certainly for me, it didn't approach that question.
Yeah.
And so I said this to him, that here I am, supposed to be an educated man, but that I don't feel that I know anything. So in a way, it was like meeting a very wise man to whom one could be open and say something. And so we had a little conversation. He was very helpful. But it's more the presence of the person. I don't feel that one can be so much influenced by exactly what these words are or that word is. All that is helpful because we are driven by our mind, by the language, so we need to know that. No, it's the presence of the person that is the most important thing.
And can you talk more about the presence? Not just with him, but generally.
Well, first of all, a little bit keeping him in mind, but also keeping other. I have been rather fortunate in my life. I have met some really very extraordinary people. Somehow, as if I should confess that I never feel that I am running my life. It seems to be running by the devas or by the angels. And they take me to places, doors somehow open without my really doing anything.
When I heard you talk the other night, you talked about the invisible piper.
Yes, well, that's actually a remark of Einstein. Maybe it'll be useful for me to mention this. Yeah, Einstein made this remark that human beings, vegetables, and cosmic dust, all of us are dancing to the tune of an invisible piper.
Yeah.
Certainly in my case it's quite obvious.
And when you felt someone's presence, did you more then realize that somehow this was happening, the invisible piper? Or
Presence seems, now everything I say to some extent really are words, trying to describe something which is a little beyond words. First of all, it has as if you're actually being listened to or being seen. All of these words, listening, seeing, not in the ordinary way. As if somebody can hear you, can see you, and are not passing judgments on it. You can be, in fact, yourself. That doesn't mean that they have no sense of discernment, that they have no idea of what you are. No, they can see even through you. In fact, on one occasion later on, I don't even know whether I mentioned that in that book on Krishnamurti. On one occasion, this was much later, I believe maybe about 1980 or something like that. Once going for a walk with Krishnamurti, I said to him, it's quite obvious to me that you can see more deeply what is going on inside me than I can. Why don't you just tell me? It'll save me some trouble. And I thought, but that's the feeling I had. So that's partly the meaning of the presence I'm talking, that he could see me, he could listen to me. Then his remark was his response was very interesting. He said, sir, he had this habit of saying, sir, sir, that will be like opening your private mail. So even though he could see, but this is not what he's not going to either would tell me, or he's not going to pass a judgment on it. In a way, to allow something to emerge in me, myself, from my own understanding, my perception, etc. That would have been very much his wish. So when you ask, what does it mean that somebody has presence? It's a quality of both a kind of, we sometimes use the word like focus of attention, but in the case of Krishnamurti especially, it was a quality of stillness, quality of, his body seemed still, his mind seemed quiet. And we had several experiences of this kind. Again, you may have even read that there, I mentioned this in fact, because I was quite convinced that his whole mind or his being was different from mine. Although he had a bit of a democratic attitude, he would say everybody can be like that. In fact, on one occasion he said to me, do you think the speaker is a freak? Because I was insisting about himself, because I was insisting that his mind is different from my mind. And he said, do you think the speaker is a freak? Now, of course, that can mean somebody who's weird or distorted, but it could also mean somebody is extraordinary. So I said yes. But now I meant it in a different way. Then on one occasion, this was actually in the house of Mary Zimbalist. His own cottage was just next to it, connected actually, in Ojai, California. So there were just three of us sitting there, Mary Zimbalist and Krishnamurti and myself. We just so happened there was a small little table between the two of us, and there was a little small vase with some flowers in it. So I said, okay, Krishnaji, this is the way we used to refer to him. Krishnaji, this is a very lovely expression actually in the Indian language. It's both affectionate as well as respectful. Not Mr. Krishnamurti.
Yes.
That's not quite the right thing. And certainly not just Krishna. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So Krishna Ji would be the way to refer to somebody like this. So I said, Krishna Ji, now you look at these flowers and tell me how your mind responds to this. And I would also look at it and I will tell you how my mind responds. Then we will see whether it's the same mind. You see, he always insisted that everybody could be like that, which I was quite convinced that that was not true. In fact, at the end of his life, he himself makes remarks like that an energy of this kind will not come into a body for many years or even hundreds of years, he speaks about. So, but on the other hand, a teacher is trying to encourage everybody, you see. So then, but I said the interest in this little experiment is more the nature of the mind. So he made this very interesting remark that he said, my mind is like a mill pond. When an impression comes, there is a slight vibration, but very soon the vibration stops and the stillness of the mill pond returns. And then he looked at me really very mischievously and said, and sir, your mind is like a mill. And I think there is validity to what he's saying. That's the truth. Our mind in general has too much noise, too many activities going on. Still mind is really, in a way, if you like, partly the aim of all spiritual teachings, that the mind can be, one can be a little free of the mental activity. The whole program of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, for example, right in the very beginning he says that yoga is stopping all the movements of the mind. Not so easy. And so that the real perception can be then through the clear mind, like a clear diamond is the expression that Patanjali uses.
Yes.
So, when we speak about the presence of somebody which is striking, that will be one quality. It's a kind of a stillness, a quietness, but interested, in that sense focused, listening, not thinking about something else while listening to somebody.
You also talk about in this little book about that you and Krishnamurti really enjoyed silence together and different forms of silence, which I just pulled out some quotes here from the book. The silence was a special delight to both of us, as it was easy to understand each other's thoughts and feelings. Silence has many qualities. There is the silence between two noises, the silence between two notes, the widening silence between two thoughts. Oh, it's repeating here. The silence through which you hear the bark of a dog in the distance or whistle of a train. And I just thought that's interesting because for me, silence, I had the idea that silence was complete silence. But there's, talk about this.
Yeah, no, the silence, actually, if you happen to get up in the middle of the night in particular, you probably know that this is actually a scientific knowledge. Earth itself is more silent at night. And if you happen to get up sometimes in the middle of the night, if you go even to different rooms in your own house where you are even familiar with them, you would find a different kind of silence. If you happen to have a microwave, likely in the kitchen, or somewhere you have a receiver for the internet connection, etc., you would feel a certain kind of agitation, a certain kind of noise.
Even though you don't hear it,
no, you don't
feel it.
Yeah.
So that interferes or changes the
Yes.
silence. Yeah.
Silence, again, see, our language imagines as if when the sound is turned off, there is silence. No,
Right.
silence is actually almost as if vibrations of very subtle kind are out, which is really, in fact, the reason why, as you know, in all of every teaching arising from India, all the sacred enunciations there begin with the word Om, but always the suggestion is that Om is the very primordial vibration which can really be heard only by people who are so evolved that they have a complete silence. Now, that doesn't mean turning off the sound. In fact, to even call it Om as a sound is not right. It's a kind of a vibration from which then ultimately, at least in the Indian tradition, the whole of the cosmos emerges. But that there are levels of silence, if you like. Sound is just one kind of noise. If you like, sound is only one kind of sound. And even the presence of any vibration, like I just mentioned, right now here, it's actually amazing to realize this. In any room where maybe have 10 people are sitting there, each one can have a cell phone, even though the cell phones are turned off, their friends may be calling them. Those vibrations are all there. Right now, BBC is transmitting many things. Voice of America is,
yes.
all those vibrations are here. This room, every room, unless you go make a special arrangement, as we sometimes do in physics laboratories, in order to make certain measurements, we have to cut out all the vibrations. So, no,
Right.
But unless you make a special arrangement of that kind, those vibrations are coming across these walls. They're going thousands of miles, and they're all here. Every space is so filled with electromagnetic waves, and if they can come through walls, they can certainly go through our bodies. Our brain is constantly being bombarded by these vibrations.
Yes, and we're not aware of that.
Yes. Because we're not aware of them, because they're not sounds in the usual sense of the
Yes.
word.
Yes.
So silence has many, many levels.
Yeah.
And similarly, stillness. Stillness, if you have ever seen a particularly good Bharatanatyam dancer, or you sometimes see a great sculpture of Shiva dancing, there is both an enormous amount of movement, but there is a stillness often at the center. So stillness is not absence of motion. Silence is not absence of sound. You go to the woods, carry a sound meter with you, you can hear all kinds of sounds are being recorded. The birds are chirping, the brook may be flowing, and the leaves are rustling. But a silence begins to descend in your soul. Silence is not absence of sound. Similarly, stillness is not absence of motion. It's a very different quality.
Yes, no, I understand. There's a lot to cover in our unfortunate finite time of a bit less than an hour. So I wanted to just gently move you on from Krishnamurti, because something you wrote this letter to him, which, if I can find the relevant quote, I'm not sure I'm going to find it that quickly. You said to him, "What you have been saying for half a century seems partial and incomplete." It seems that was something in you was working in terms of, I don't know if it's right, the word embodiment, but more the human side of life, which you didn't always felt that he may be recognized.
Yes, it of course could naturally be also possible that I'm not quite understanding him fully. One should be always careful. Everybody comes from one's own understanding or one's own level. No, but for me personally, this has been actually, if you like, overall my general uneasiness with the vast amount of the whole of Indian tradition. There's so much strong emphasis on, as if, especially coming from Vedantic tradition very much, as if the whole world is a maya, it's an illusion, and that if you were really spiritually advanced, then you will not be born again. What's wrong with being born? As if being born is a mistake, is a punishment, as if we have no particular function here, we don't have a purpose here to be incarnated. Similarly, all this manifested world is an error. So it's really partly that kind of a general background one needs to keep in mind. And I personally feel this is only one aspect of the Indian teaching, but it has been so much emphasized by Vedanta, particularly people who get into this non-duality business. They are just gung-ho about it, as if anything which is manifested is really somehow an error. and Krishnamurti similarly would occasionally has said, as if you can, I'm afraid these are partial things, but people can latch on to this. Analysis is paralysis. But you know, most people who are trustees of the Krishnamurti Foundation are there because they could do proper analytical work and thinking, etc., like David Bohm and many other people like this. So, no, I think often you come across this kind of remark from Krishnamurti in a certain context, that you can leave the world and give up your job, etc., etc. To me, wholeness really requires all aspects of myself are involved, the body also needs to be nourished. If I don't have any job for which I get paid, how am I going to nourish my body? It's all very fine to have somebody set up a trust fund for me, and so I don't have to do any work. So, and actually in that very letter I had mentioned this, in fact, giving the example of the Buddha. To me, it did not seem right that the Buddha, who after all, as it were, conquered the kingdom of the other world, refused to be the king of this world. Why set up this as it dichotomy? Why couldn't he do both? As if this world is irrelevant or not significant, not important. This runs very deeply in the Indian tradition. That's why I'm mentioning this here. So it therefore troubles me personally. And in fact, I would say, I don't know whether one comes to all this so knowingly, so consciously, but deep down one has tendencies. For me, this is perhaps one of the attractions of the Gurdjieff teaching. In the Gurdjieff teaching, just to use the language of particularly Madame de Salzmann, with whom I actually worked, I never met Gurdjieff. He died in 1949.
Yeah, we should just make clear that you were introduced to Madame de Salzmann, and she had taken over the lineage of tradition or the teaching.
Yes, she was regarded really
Yeah.
the person responsible for
Yes.
Gurdjieff's work after Gurdjieff's death. Gurdjieff died in 1949, and she herself, therefore, was, if you like, in charge of the work until her own death in 1990 at the age of 101.
And you met her when she was 91.
I met her when she was 91.
And she became your mentor for the next
Yes, very
few
much.
years.
Yeah.
Yes.
If there is anyone I would really call my teacher, although really in a way one has many teachers. Mrs. Welch was
Yeah.
also my teacher. I have had physics teachers,
Yeah.
mathematics teachers. I am personally quite happy to call Krishnamurti as my teacher, although in general he rather objected to the idea of having having students or having disciples. So that's fine with me. But in any case, she actually makes this remark. This is first of all, first part of it is fairly universal idea that we have two natures. Using St. Paul's terminology, we have a carnal nature and we have a spiritual nature, sometimes called higher nature, lower nature, and often they are in opposition to each other. But her remark is that sure, we have an angelic nature and an animal nature, but both of these natures need to be attended to. This is very deep in the Gurdjieff teaching, that both heaven and earth, they don't use this expression, I'm using that expression. We are children of both heaven and earth. Both parents need to be honored, not just go to heaven, not just become pure spirit, which is very strong tendency in the Indian, actually all religions have this. No, we are also of the earth. This is our world. We are responsible for it. And if I just want to become pure spirit and it doesn't matter what the hell is going on in the world, this is not, certainly not from the Gurdjieff point or Gurdjieff teaching point of view, very strong emphasis that if we do not work, the quality of life on the earth will suffer, and that we are responsible for it.
She talked a lot about attention and real listening.
Yes. Well, attention really, in a way, whatever field you are in, you may be writing music, you may be doing physics, anywhere, attention is always what is required, even in our conversation right now. Right? But naturally, there are qualities of attention. In fact, this might actually interest you, probably more clearly expressed in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali than almost anywhere else in my reading. If I am looking at something or somebody, supposing I'm speaking to you, one quality of attention can be, I'm here, you are there. He actually has technical words for it called dharana in Sanskrit. further or a deeper quality of attention is, you are there, I am more and more diminished. I am not, it's like seeing, but the seer is not very separate. Krishnamurti very much emphasized this. Observer and the observed are the same. This is his expression. Then, this again is very important to understand, that all spiritual teaching actually aims at not freedom for myself, but freedom from myself. That is the highest state of attention, in which I am not completely objective. So whatever, if I am looking at you, it's not Ravi looking at you, you revealing yourself to a receptive attention. Krishnamurti also had a very interesting remark about this. As long as I am, love is not. And this is the whole meaning of samadhi. Patanjali's Yoga Sutra explicitly, I sometimes invite people to look at it. It's the third sutra in the third chapter of Yoga Sutra. Samadhi is, the Sanskrit expression is swarup shunya, I am not. So that there is pure seeing without any separate seer. So attention has many qualities. All of these are attention. But an attention in which there is no subject and object division, and then an attention in which, as it were, subject doesn't even exist. The Buddha also speaks about this in different ways. And we see many resonance of this kind of idea, but how people understand this naturally varies. For example, Christ says in the Gospel of Thomas, unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine. Now what does it mean to leave myself behind? All my conditioned self, if I am from India, I am attuned to a certain kind of attitude. If you are from Britain, it's a different attitude. If you are from Japan, it's a different. If I am male, it's different from a female. If I come from a poor family, it's different from coming from a rich family. If I'm coming in the 20th century, it's different from somebody born in the 1st century. You see, we're constantly conditioned, and that is myself. How to be free of that self?
What kind of work did she do with you to help you realize this?
Well, this is difficult to pin down because there are many things. Again, one should remember, actual teaching, any teaching, in fact, takes place through one's presence. It's not a particular trick or a particular technique. Of course, all those things exist, particularly in the Gurdjieff teaching. There are movements, we call them just movements, really sacred dances coming from quite ancient traditions or ancient temples.
And these are very hard, aren't they? Because it's very, each leg and arm is doing something different at the same time. These are different.
Yeah. Well, certainly publicly one can, the film that was directed by Peter Brook, at the end of that film, I think for the last perhaps 12 or 14 minutes, there are several movements being shown.
This is the meetings with remarkable men.
With remarkable men.
Yeah.
So if anybody actually wants to see that, that's where they can see them.
Yes.
They're not easy to do, let me assure you.
Yes.
However, one doesn't begin with that difficult thing right away, but really to become more and more aware of how my body actually, if I move my arm like this, what is taking place inside? It's not so easy. So much emphasis of behind the movements, particularly Madame de Salzmann emphasized this very much. There is an energy in us that is in us or in the body, but it is not of the body. This itself is very important to understand. If I used slightly more traditional religious language, one might say, it's not the body that has the spirit, it's the spirit that has the body for some purpose. Now, if I use more the language that Madame de Salzmann used, she said a higher energy for its own purposes takes on a body. And if the person, then the person with, when we use the word body, we include the mind, ordinary mind. And if a person works, then one can serve this needs of the spirit. Otherwise, the body is designed to die.
Yeah, she talked a lot about connecting with or staying or
With
being
the-
aware of the connection with
That's
the
right.
higher energies.
Sometimes she would call it the higher mind or
Yes.
higher energy. And so, very much the idea that your incarnation or my incarnation, everybody's incarnation here, is not just accidental, that there is an energy subtler than our usual energy. In the Gurdjieff teaching, or really in any spiritual teaching, when they speak about levels, they mean levels of consciousness. So there are many levels of energy, and a higher energy, which means higher than my usual organism, needs the organism for undertaking any action. And if this organism or my body, I can use the word body, is just simply doing its own thing for its own purposes, for its own pleasure, so it's not serving this energy. And the body will of course die. It's designed to die. But this other energy does not die at the same time as this body dies.
Yes. There's a quote that I pulled out,
Yeah.
which quite intrigued me from
Heart
the Heart Without Measure book. I began to realize, the quote from you obviously, I began to realize that everything is in the body. I had been reading that for decades, but had not understood it earlier.
Yeah.
Is that something you would still agree with? Everything is in the body?
Everything is in the body in the sense that we cannot actually experience anything unless it somehow is sensed in the body or felt in the body. Ordinarily, in our usual English language, we don't make these distinctions between sensing something or feeling something. In the Gurdjieff literature, there is important differences are made to be for clarification. No, even this might interest you. Sri Anirvan, a highly regarded sage in India, who fortunately I had the occasion to meet him for about half an hour in 1979. He died the very next year. He wrote a very significant book, often conversations with somebody from Switzerland, who later on came to the work because he recommended her to find the Gurdjieff work in Switzerland. He makes this remark that even the subtlest spiritual experiences are experienced as sensations in the body. So in that sense, everything that we experience is sensed in the body. But they don't belong to the body. If I sense the light coming, the light doesn't belong to the body. But unless it is sensed in the body, I'm not aware of this. So in that sense, to become aware, that one needs to actually begin to pay attention to the body, to watch where something is felt, and then to find in, this is actually very strongly felt, much more so in the movements or the sacred dances than almost anywhere else, to begin to orient one's gestures, one's posture, that one allows a more deeper and deeper sensation. Just as in thought there are many levels, in feeling there are many levels, but in sensation also there are many levels. So, no, therefore to begin to pay attention to the body becomes more serious part of the work.
And was that difficult for you at times, that process, or was it something you fell into relatively naturally?
No, it is. I think those of us, and I suppose I am one of them, who fairly early on get much more sort of academically oriented and therefore much more head oriented, we tend to get a little almost living from here. In fact, this was one of the things which increasingly disillusioned me about all of this great academics and philosophers and scientists. I was at the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, seeing all these very bright people, hardly any connection with their own bodies. It's all in the head. And so I suppose in my own case also, since you know how it is, oh, you're a smart guy in the school, etc., etc. So it all tends to get very much in the head. So it was not easy. I don't know whether even now it's so easy for me. But if one begins to honor something, then you wish to make room for it. If you begin to understand even intellectually that it is important to connect with the body, then one wishes to find the right receptivity, right posture. What is it that interferes? After all, it's plainly obvious. Every religious tradition says that God is everywhere or Holy Spirit is everywhere. So it's right here. Holy Spirit is right here. How is it that it's not touching me? How do I make it possible? So then one becomes more and more aware that somehow I am not letting God actually touch me. I don't need to use the word God, whatever word we like, but every sage has said that the entire space is permeated by subtle energies, or cosmic intelligence is the expression Einstein uses. Classically one would have said God. Every sage has said this, without exception. Doesn't matter whether they're Hindus or Muslims or Christians. If that is even, if we allow that possibility, so the Holy Spirit is right here. Something is required from me for that Holy Spirit to actually touch me. So the ideal would be that the Holy Spirit could act through me, use my mind, my body, my language, but rather than Ravi speaking, Krishna could speak.
I think one of the things you said on Tuesday night towards the end is the greatest mystery of all is who am I?
Yes, well,
it kind
that
of
is
comes back to that, doesn't it? On our journey, on our quests.
Yeah.
This, who am I?
It is actually in a way the greatest mystery, and in fact all traditions would also say that. And partly because, at least in theory, very strong suggestion, even in the Bible, that human beings are made in the image of God. But the general idea that a fully developed human being can mirror the entire cosmos, all the levels, from God down to the dead matter. So if that is theoretically allowed as a possibility, then the question clearly becomes very relevant. What am I? I prefer the word actually, or the sentence, what am I, even more than who am I, because who am I still, as if I have to take it too personally. You know? What am I makes it a little bit more scientific sounding expression.
Yes.
It's actually,
Yes.
but then associated with it almost always the question, why am I here? Why would this vast universe, even when you and I are speaking, hundreds of galaxies are appearing and disappearing. And we are just in a very ordinary average galaxy around a very peripheral star. So it's hardly arranged around me. But then why would these subtle energies in the universe take the trouble of making me alive for a few decades? Why am I here? This question is very deeply connected with what am I or who am I?
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the clock and we need to finish in a minute or two, and I quite like to finish this interview with the question, why am I here?
I agree.
It's
I hope anybody who is listening to this would actually ask oneself, what am I and why am I here?
Thank you, Ravi.
You're very welcome.
I'm going to show a couple of your books again, the ones that I've read anyway. Heart Without Measure, about the Gurdjieff work with Madame de Salzmann, and the little book, Two Birds on One Tree,
Krishnamurti.
about Krishnamurti,
Yes.
and also science and the sacred.
Yeah.
And thank you for watching Conscious TV, and I hope we see you again soon. Goodbye.